I'm sorry we didn't get that great introduction, but you can Google Randall Pine.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction. I don't think I've been in this room ever, but I think I was in this floor a lot growing up. And I know we had Boy Scouts here and summer programs, and so it's interesting kind of coming back 20 years or more, 30 years maybe even, since last time I was on this floor of this church. As my dad said, I grew up in Birmingham. I've always had an affinity for buildings and real estate development and ultimately historic preservation. And I didn't really know that until really the last 5-10 years, where it just has turned out that the projects that I work on the most and where I have the most fun are ones where we are preserving some historic building. And so I can tell you about a whole bunch of deals that I've worked on. And I've got a PowerPoint, but I didn't really want to show it to you guys because then I would have been talking for 2 or 3 hours, but I'm gonna I did have some disclaimers. I'm not a historic preservation expert. I'm not an architect, not a developer, not an investment banker, not an accountant. I'm not a real lawyer that you see on TV. And I'm not gonna talk about any local projects. That's what I've written. But then, Dad, I heard you say, so I definitely, I'll be vague, but there's a lot of projects that I work on locally that are just not just historic preservation, but there are other types of deals. But about 5 years ago during COVID, and I had been introduced to this project in 2016, so almost 10 years ago, in Mobile, Alabama, for the school called the Barton Academy. And I'd never really heard about it. I really didn't know much about Mobile. I think I only been to Mobile once or twice in my life and really just kind of passing through. But Mobile is, one of the only cities in the state of Alabama that predates the incorporation of the state. So they have a lot of special rules that apply in Mobile that don't apply other places because they were established before the state of Alabama was. And the first school building, public school building in the state of Alabama was in Mobile. It was a building called Barton Academy. When you look at it, it looks like the Capitol building in the US, Washington, DC. I mean, it's that scale. It's got a rotunda. When I first was introduced to it, it had been vacant since the 80s. And the history of it, I learned as I worked on the project, was that it was the first public school in Alabama. There were a lot of white alumni, from Mobile that went there and cherished it. And then mysteriously in the 50s and 60s, it stopped being a public school. And then it became the headquarters for the Mobile County public school system. And then they subsequently moved out of downtown Mobile into kind of an area closer to where the airport is now. And so it hadn't been a school, since the 50s or 60s. And a group of local, I'll call them do-gooders, wanted to preserve the building, had a vision for returning it to school use. And so they had reached out to me because one of my law partners was on that board. And he knew that I had an interest in these types of things, and that for better or for worse, I would take the time to figure out how to do it. And so we started the journey in 2016, and we closed that deal in 2020. So during COVID, second or third month of COVID, it was about a $20 million transaction to rehab the building, retrofit it, put in modern equipment, and then it's now operational as a school. And when it opened up as a school, that was the first time students of color ever got educated in that building. So that was a project that I was working on, and really, as I was kind of going through that process of learning about it and learning how to put these things together, really started thinking about preservation in general, and got in touch just because of fortunately, we're in Birmingham and we have a lot of historic resources. And so while I was working on this project, there was an effort, and I think it happened like right as I started working on this project where the Civil Rights District in Birmingham was designated, a portion that was designated as a national monument. Through that process, I got to meet a lot of historic preservation experts, that work for the National Trust of Historic Preservation and work for other groups, and really kind of started understanding, all right, this is how these things are put together ultimately, to where you can do a transaction like this. So what I always tell people, I give that disclaimer, I'm not a historic preservation person, not an architect, et cetera. What I always tell people though is that about half of my clients are nonprofits. The other half are developers. And that kind of fits my personality, growing up in Sixth Avenue, there are a lot of things, that, I kind of took away, but the biggest one was, to whom much is given, much is required, right? That was every Sunday, people were saying that. And then obviously at the house, I was hearing that sort of thing. And so that always has been a focus of mine. And, just happened that, that I was able to kind of figure out how to do that sort of thing, in my law practice. So a lot of the projects I work on, with nonprofits, which, generally don't have a lot of money to pay a law firm like the one I'm at. But, part of the opportunity and challenge that I have is we have to figure out how to get paid, right? We have to figure out how to do the project, but we also have to figure out how to get paid. And so that really is something that, I focus a lot on, in terms of these transactions. In terms of goals for projects, when I go into a project, and I'm gonna kind of just give a couple of examples just of things that, literally I just saw kind of coming over here. And, these are things that I kind of drive around all the time. And I'm always thinking about just different ways we can, make something happen from a real estate standpoint. But the main things, there's like 3 or 4 project goals that I have every time, I get involved in one of these transactions. And again, my clients are nonprofits or real estate developers. And let me just clarify that, meaning a nonprofit like Sixth Avenue Baptist Church that has the asset, ideally, they also have resources, because not, there's a million projects that could happen because we all know there's nonprofits everywhere that have assets. But you have to have a little bit more than the assets. You have to have, people that are willing to put the time in, to volunteer, to put money in, to do a capital campaign raise, going to that Barton Academy transaction. That local nonprofit there raised about 1/3 of the cost of the deal. So they raised about $5 or $6 million to get the project done.
We lost the volume.
Yeah, I was saying that on the Barton Academy transaction I was talking about in Mobile, the local nonprofit there had raised about $6 million, $5 or $6 million, and we were able to turn that into $20 million. But the project doesn't happen without that $5 or $6 million that they raised kind of on faith, and it also doesn't happen with a lot of people working to put the deal together. So working very hard to, countless hours of fundraising, countless hours of meetings. They had to deal with me and the millions of documents that we sent their way. So the projects don't happen without those sort of things. So what I try to do in these projects is, identify, any constraints and limitations on the front end. And then we try to design something that fits within those constraints. Common constraints include, if they have an existing lender or debt, what are the covenants that existing lender or debt provider has? do they own the real estate? You know, do they actually have clear title to it? Because if they don't have clear title to it, a lot of times that creates other issues, in terms of actually building a construction project. Resources are always limited. You know, people generally don't, seek my services, unless they have a lack of resources. That's generally how it works, for me. And then, time, you know, time constraints. Sometimes we get involved in things where there's just a short time fuse and, you know, the building might be falling down, or there might be some opportunity that whoever it is has. And we got to move quickly, to make that happen. Second thing I try to do on these projects is to leverage as much OTM as possible, other people's money. You know, and I didn't want to bore you guys with kind of structure diagrams, but that really is the key to all of these projects is how do you take what you have and then combine it with other things that are out there? You know, so we all know about grants and we know about fish fries and stuff like that, but you know, there are other mechanisms, there are tax credits, there are, a lot of times you can go to the city or local government and get money, or get a loan. There's a lot of foundations out there, for certain projects. There's national foundations out there. So there's a lot of different ways to do these things. Another thing that I try to focus on is trying to retain as much ownership and control as possible for the client. And so what I mean by that is, you know, I get a lot of calls where people say, because they hear that I know about real estate and are interested in it. So they'll say, hey, we got some family property over here, or we've got, you know, some commercial building that somebody donated to us. And hey, can we do a project based on that? Because we own it, you know, free and clear. You know, that my answer always is, you know, some derivative of, yeah, we can, you know, on paper, we can do anything, right?
Yeah.
On paper. And then this question is, what are you willing to give up, if anything, to make that happen? Because a lot of times, and I'm gonna go on a tangent here, but a lot of times the things that you hear about and we know about just based on lived experience, but you hear about in terms of certain properties not appraising the same way other properties would, that definitely happens. And a lot of times, ultimately, when you kind of do the math on putting the whole deal together, the land value or the building value sometimes is negative, right? Because at the end of the day, you have to overcome that. And so even though you have this asset that everybody knows is an asset, there's not anything that we can point to and use these kind of tools that are out there to make that asset into something that's valuable. And so that is a big thing that I focus on. And, you know, fortunately, with a lot of transactions that I work on, we don't necessarily need bank appraisals in the same way. And so we're not as constrained by the regulatory requirements, you know, that banks have. But that is a significant hurdle. And so when I say retain as much ownership as possible, it doesn't feel good to people to say, wait a minute, you know, we've got this asset, we know it's an asset. The appraisal says it's, you know, $2 or, you know, $100,000 for a building that we know to rebuild it today would cost millions of dollars, but they're saying it's only $200,000. That doesn't make sense. And then you're telling me that in order to do a historic tax credit deal, I've got to bring on an investor partner, and that investor partner is going to have an ownership interest in the deal. That doesn't feel good for anybody. And it's definitely not a conversation I like to have with people, but I have it on the front end to say, all right, there are going to be some things, if you really want to do this transaction, that may or may not feel like it's the right thing, just fundamentally based on your understanding of how economics work and how projects work. But I've done a lot of these deals. The way, if we're successful on paper structuring it, and if you operate it at the end of a compliance period, and usually that compliance period is 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, it kind of depends. Usually there's a way for that kind of temporary pain to go away. So that's what we try to do on the front end is kind of, advise people of that structure around that. Fortunately, unfortunately, a lot of projects I work on, we don't have a lot of working capital, is what people say, meaning that, we've got, if it costs $10 million to build the project, we have $9,999,000, dollars. We don't have any extra dollars, so if there's a delay in construction or some contractor makes a mistake, then, we don't have a complete project. And then we end up, completing the project, but we don't have any furniture or, whatever it is, for the project. And so that happens a fair amount. And I like to kind of talk about the Barton project because we ended up with a surplus of $2 million at the end of the deal. And so now that $2 million is something that, that foundation can use to build around the school. And so that, it's one of the kind of best, case studies I have of something where we had it on paper and then it actually worked better than what we thought on paper. And I'm just kind of talking, high level, and I definitely kind of have a tendency to get in the weeds, but just talking through this. The other thing I focus on a lot is, are there things, all right, so if we own the land and, are there things that we can do with our ownership structure or our entity structure, that allows us to be in a position where, okay, we're concerned about these, whoever it is, these third-party people that Randall's bringing into this deal. We don't want them owning this land ever. So are there things that we can do strategically that would protect us? And so, so that's something that we work on a lot. So on the Barton Academy deal, and I use that one just because it has a lot of, actually, there's a question too. But I use that as an example because we were able to implement a lot of controls there, along the lines of like what I like to think about on these deals. The school system owns that property. They own the land. The building, technically right now, is not owned by the school system. We had to do a partnership with a tax credit investor to do that. So technically the school building is not owned by the school. Imagine going to a school system and saying, you can't own the school, right? That doesn't sound right to anybody, right? And so what we did is we created a ground lease structure where it's basically the school land is owned by the school board, and then they lease it to this tax credit structure that we created. And, that tax credit structure is gonna be in place. There's a minimum compliance period that has to be in place. And I think for the historic tax credits we did, that unwinds, I think next year. And then there's we did another set of tax credits on that. And that unwinds in about 2 years after that, so 3 years from now. But you put all that stuff together and, that's how you're able to take $6 million and put it into $20 million because, people were willing to, take that risk of, hey, we understand that this is the only way to preserve this building because nobody's gonna throw $15 million, extra into the school building when you could build a new building for, that much money, right? And so that was kind of the pitch that was made. And at the end of the day, when you go and see this building, you couldn't build that today for less than $50 million, right? The replacement value of that quality of construction is a multiple of what, people do today. And so that's, was really a fun one for me and, something that kind of got together a lot of different tools that we have. And I'm just gonna list these out. And I see there's a question, so I'll stop. Let's see, like Gregory Brown has a question.
Yeah. You want to answer it now, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm good, yeah.
All right, Greg. Can you hear me?
We can't hear you.
Ask him to unmute.
Greg? Unmute yourself.
he might have to change his, input for audio.
Can you unmute? Well, I see your mouth moving, Greg.
We don't hear you.
I can't hear you.
Yeah, we can
Well,
come back,
what-
yeah, I'll come back to him.
We'll come back to you in a minute.
Alright, so the, one of the things that, ideally, when I'm working on these projects is, and I always tell people, if you really wanna do it, what are you willing to give up? But I also say, I'm gonna need about $300,000 or $400,000, right? In terms of pre-development costs. And that is for accountants, it's for architects, it's for, a consultant, probably one or two consultants. It's to do all the real estate and title work in the background. It's to do the environmental, analysis. So that, I always tell people that, hey, it's gonna cost you this much to get in the game. Is that what you're trying to do? And if not, that's fine. We still can talk about what your project is and different ways to do it, but that really is the key, is having the right project team. So I spend a lot of time now, now that I've been doing this, for over a decade in terms of this type of work. I spend a lot of time now trying to work with the same project team if I can. And it may be a different architect and it may be a different contractor. But really it's, one or two consultants that we've kind of worked together on these types of deals before. They know how I communicate, I know how they communicate. The accountants are really helpful, critical here, in terms of the projects that I do. I try to work with only one or two accountants, on the historic preservation side. And I'm gonna talk about a whole bunch of different things, but, let's just pause and just say, a lot of what I do is federal law. It's federal tax policy. It matters who's in the White House, one of those things, right? And so a lot of the tools that are out there, for better or for worse, are tools that, there are definitely projects that I have that are, DEI projects that I worked on. There are also projects that I have that are not DEI, that are the opposite, they're, what do they call it? They call themselves agnostic. So I've got just it's a blessing, but I've got a whole host of people that I work with. But at the end of the day, and I was telling somebody this earlier today, that a lot of these tax credit projects, strategically, but also fortuitously, they are in every congressional district in this country. And so at the end of the day, no matter who your senator is or who your congressperson is, there's a project that's used one of the tools that, I've been kind of alluding to them, but I haven't listed them out, that has happened in their district. And so when I've gone to the kind of flying days to DC, they'll have a book of all the projects by district, right? And so, at the end of the day, it does matter, that all these different departments are getting slashed. I just talked kind of specifically on a certain kind of subset of projects that we worked on. This is a good opportunity to talk about it. So, in the last couple of days, the Federal Department of Education, has been gutted. And so one of the programs under the Federal Department of Education is a special loan program for historically Black colleges and universities, right? So the HBCU capital loan program, because of the type of work that our firm does traditionally, we do a lot of bond work before I got there. There are 7 HBCUs in Alabama, and I kind of knew that from growing up. My dad worked at UNCF, but I didn't know about the specialty finance program. And so when I joined Maynard almost 12, 13 years ago, started learning about that HBCU capital loan program is across the country. So we've worked with HBCUs throughout the country on that capital loan program. And one of the things we started doing, and actually one of the first tax credit projects I did when I moved back to Birmingham, was actually for Miles College, and using the HBCU capital loan program with New Markets tax credits to do the student facility center that's there now. And, you know, we've done that same type of project, you know, for Claflin University, you know, for, Texas College, you know, for Talladega, for, Oakwood. I mean, I could probably go on for like 15 more minutes on just the HBCUs that we've worked with. And, you know, that was just a tool that, kind of, it was fortuitous, you know, it just so happened, you know, I moved back to Birmingham, when the state of Alabama has started a state store tax credit program and a state new markets program. And so no other lawyer in Alabama knew anything about them because they just were established. So I was able to get there, on the ground floor and kind of work on those projects. And so the first big, historic tax credit deal I did in Birmingham was for the Lyric Theater. So that was another one. And again, the same kind of dynamic of, you know, they had raised a lot of money.
Yeah.
But not enough. And so they had a gap. And so we brought in federal and state historic tax credits to bridge that gap. And that made it, you know, I don't know if you've been there, but it's an amazing facility now. And, you know, it's been there the whole time, right? And then they had people from across the country come in and work on it. You about to say something?
Yeah, why don't we stop there and allow some questions? Greg, are you ready? Can you hear me? Looks like your mic is open. Well, apparently not. Well,
You might do that dial-in thing that.
have you done any church-related projects?
We have, so we've worked with a couple of churches, you know, I'll be a little vague, in Michigan, in North Carolina, and in Alabama. We've worked with churches. You know, churches are, nonprofits, you know, a lot of times, right? And you know, at the end of the day, there's a different set of, challenges in working with churches. And one of them is, not every bank wants to lend to a church, right, and just in general, right? But, you know, the other thing is that, you know, church governance, you know, varies, you know, across, the spectrum of things. And so what happens in every commercial real estate transaction, and, you know, that's really what I do is commercial real estate transactions, as part of the closing process, there has to be an authorizing resolution. That means, you know, the board of whoever the governing body has to approve.
The deacons.
You know, borrowing the money or putting a mortgage down and all that sort of thing. And then, so the bank lawyer will look at the organizational documents. And they'll look at the bylaws and they'll see, all right, what are the circumstances under which X, Y, Z can occur? And, you know, sometimes the church bylaws don't always align with what, a corporate banker would want to see for a variety of reasons. So you end up with churches, you end up kind of working with specialty lawyers, banks for the most part. But yeah, I mean, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Alfred Hunt.
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll hear you loud and clear.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the Mr. Manor for coming back to Birmingham to live after living in New York. I went to school in New York and worked there for about 10 years. So I know what it's like to be in a place that you really don't want to stay. You're there for the experience, but I'm glad to see I'm glad that you decided to come back. Hopefully, the experience that you had in New York can help you help the community grow, because I believe that you come back with a different perspective than you had before you left. But the question I really have, do you do any pro bono work for youth ministry, for youth organization? The youth ministry that I've started, we're at the ground bottom. I'm listening to you talk about the 5 million and all of that. So we're at the very bottom. So I would like to know, do you do any volunteer work and could be advised, helping us with fundraising, you know, any way possible, really?
Yep, I'm not a fundraising, I need to add that, I'm not a fundraising expert. That's Ray Minor, you know, he's a fundraising expert, but.
Okay.
But I do,
You had a question?
I probably spend about 3 or 4 hours every week
I see you.
kind of talking to different folks, about projects and, you know, the end of the day, like I was saying before, you know, if you're trying to do a large scale project, I mean, it takes a lot of money to get there, right?
But these are not large scales.
Yeah.
Well, I'm talking with your father, so maybe one of these days we can just spend a few minutes talking.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, that's, I have those conversations pretty regularly.
All right, Greg, last pitch. 3 strikes you out.
Your hand up, Greg.
His mouth was moving. We still don't hear you.
Maybe he can put his question in the chat.
All right. Good suggestion.
I got a question.
All right, Tim.
Talk about money. I'm looking at this guy Musk and Trump up there. The grant and stuff that you're dealing with and the money thing, are you expecting situations?
Yeah, so, I'm gonna, it's gonna take me about 3 minutes to answer the
Okay,
question.
take that when you want.
Alright,
That's
so in 2017, they passed the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And really what they wanted to do was lower corporate taxes and do a lot of amendments to the tax code that benefit basically property owners. And so they passed that in 2017. The first drafts of that legislation contemplated taking out historic tax credits significantly, taking out new markets tax credits, taking out tax exempt bonds. So like, you know, that's what cities use, you know, to do a lot of their infrastructure. And so that there was about a 2-month period of back and forth where all the lobbying groups for, you know, the tax credits, the bond industry, et cetera, they were lobbying Congress to say, no, you can't do this. You know, so like one of the compromises was, all right, so we're gonna play this game where, and you know, people that know this better than I am, so I'm kind of high level in it. But when you pass legislation, they score, they score it from an economic standpoint. So what does this tax change mean for the federal government in terms of the actual receipts the federal government receives? And there's this Byrd rule that says that it basically has to balance itself out. So you can't have so many cuts or whatever it is you're doing, and then it has a negative economic effect. And so with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, what they figured out was they could do it for 7 years and it would balance. And then if they let it go after 7 years, then the rest of the money would come in, and that's what made it balance. So what's going on now is we're in that period of, all right, we're 7 years after that Tax Cut and Jobs Act. So a lot of the ideas they had are gonna expire this year. So they're laser focused on that. So that's part of the reason why, you know, in my view, they're focusing on all these cuts. And they're trying to get as much money as possible so that when they go to do the scoring, they're starting from a positive position. So what, what I think is gonna happen is, you know, obviously it's just me, I'm not in DC. You know, I think there's gonna be a lot of talk about cutting a lot of these programs, you know, that they've already been doing. But I think the ones that are community development focused, that are projects that have to happen regardless, you know, they're projects that we're working on now, you know, in rural Alabama, you know, that, you know, Katie Britt's not gonna let not happen, right?
I got you.
You know, I mean, that's the reality, and there's projects like that in every, you know, congressional district. or at least one congressional district in every state that are projects that would not happen but for tax exempt bonds, new market tax credits, or historic tax credits, whatever it is. And for the most part, these are major projects.
Mhm.
You know, these are, you know, one of the projects that we have now is in Silicaga for a workforce development center, and it's $30 million plus. You know, what other $30 million investment is happening in Silicaga? It's not, you know, and so the end of the day, like I think that's what's gonna happen ultimately. The unfortunate thing is, and this is in the weeds thing, but just to kind of give you an idea of like what I see it impacting. So within the last 2 or 3 years, and actually even on the Barton Academy deal, there were, they're called community development entities. So entities that are certified with the Department of Treasury to do community focused projects. They submit applications to the Department of Treasury requesting tax credits, an allocation of tax credits. And a lot of those entities said, we, you know, in various words, we want to work on Black projects in low income communities in places like Birmingham, places like, you know, pick your favorite southeastern city. So they had that in their application to the federal government, and they got allocated the tax credits based on that. And some of the investors in the tax credit space, you know, I've had conversation with them, you know, the last 5 years. They said for a project that is minority focused, that has Black leadership, ownership, we will pay more tax credit money. You know, so we will, instead of paying 80 cents on the dollar, we'll pay 82 cents on the dollar. You know, and that, you know, that's material, you know, it's a couple $100,000 depending on the project size. And so when, you know, Trump came in, the applications for the latest round of tax credits were due, you know, a couple of weeks after inauguration. And literally the day before the applications are due, you know, these first of these kind of Doge, you know, things comes out that they're focusing on DEI. So literally throughout the tax credit industry on the new market side, people went through their applications and removed anything that remotely looked like DEI. So their application that is into the federal government now, it is agnostic, you know, to use the word. So that's what, you know, practically is happening. I think there will be some of these entities that have gotten tax credits before that won't get them because of, you know, these changes that they've made. But, you know, so that's negative, I would say. But the reality though is that most of these organizations that have the infrastructure to do these types of projects, they're creative enough to where, you know, they're not gonna tell you that's what their focus is. You know, they're not gonna tell you, hey, we're focused on DEI. But look at the projects that they do. It'll be the same projects, you know. And so like that's what I think is gonna happen. I mean, I think some of these people are not gonna get allocation, unfortunately. But I don't think it means that projects won't, a good project still won't happen. A marginal one may not happen. But that, you know, that just kind of depends on, you know, the specifics.
So in other words, when they did away with the DEI, the thing that Lyndon Johnson passed in the 60s, when he did away with that, that really affected. That's the thing that really.
I think there's a lot of things they're doing, but kind of bringing it down to one thing, that's how it impacts what I do on a day-to-day basis is, you know, they're specifically focusing on certain types of projects. And so some of these entities that have gotten these tax credits before, you know, they're gonna have to document things differently.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, even if these projects are DEI projects, quote unquote, they still have an underwriting that goes through them. And so at the end of the day, you know, they're objectively, someone will be able to look at it and say, all right, that thing created jobs. It actually was a real project, it happened. So I don't think anybody really can complain just from a federal government deficit standpoint.
All right, let's see if we can get Greg in this time. He had a foul last time, so this is your third pitch coming at you.
Can you hear us, Greg?
Greg? Strike. All right. Any other questions? Somebody's got, oh, it's you. Back on the church-related projects. Are there any, could a church that owned this property? So,
Don't say that.
all right,
We hear you on the phone.
Pretty minor for proving for me that the Yale Law School is not the source of all evil. And because this type of work, this niche that he has found for himself and his law firm is going to be greatly needed by a lot of HBCUs as well as other ownership of that building. And same thing that McDonald's has been doing with its franchisees. McDonald's owns the land.
Okay.
Don't the franchise is gone. Okay. So just happy to see him. I want to thank him for coming back to Birmingham because I can't.
Talk to you later, Greg. Thank you.
any other questions?
I did, let me see, in real estate. I did some research right quick, cause I didn't know where you were coming from. I was amazed about some things I found out. I'm gonna share this with you all right quick. I asked this thing about who owned real estate in America and found out that the Emerson family in California, the largest landowner, 2,330,000
Acres?
acres of land in California. The next one on there was American Indian, 56 million.
A tribe,
That's
separate nation.
that's all the, John Malone, this is the one that really got me. The Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints,
That's the Mormons, isn't it?
1.7 million acres of land. Then what Greg was talking about, I zoomed on now, talking about that. McDonald's does own all the land that they franchise, they own the land.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things too, you have, when you're doing it, do you all have to get titles for the land before y'all, you go through all that, don't you?
Correct, yeah, and we'll work with title
Clear
companies and try to, see what the situation is, and, you know, that's the biggest thing, because if you're, especially if you have a lender involved, they're gonna want some collateral, and you can put a mortgage on a property, even though it's a ground lease, so there's a way to do that. And so it doesn't mean that the fee owner, the person that owns it, you know, Mormon Church or McDonald's, the lender forecloses on the building, McDonald's still owns the land, right? And so that's what, a lot of transactions, you know, involved, and I mean, a lot of stuff that I worked on in New York kind of had that sort of structure where
That's true.
All right, Dr. Wanda has her hand up.
Thank you. Randall, can you tell us, are there any opportunities for people of color to be on the side of not begging for money, but actually becoming owners? Does that make sense to you, what I'm asking?
Does,
Owners of what?
Well, I meant the investors. Are there any opportunities for people of color to be investors?
yeah, so I've got, I had somebody call me recently, and I'll be a little vague, but it was, a consultant, and it goes back to Dad, your question about churches. A consultant called me because they had, a partnership with somebody that was connected with this church, and the church has, let's call it 70 acres outside of a major city, in the Midwest. And, the question they asked me was, all right, how do we make money off of this? You know, and the thing that I've been, fortunate to be involved in a lot of is those types of projects where, at the end of the day, when going back to what you said, if you try to find in Alabama 100 acres contiguous, that's very difficult to find, right? And that's Alabama. And, we're relatively rural compared to other parts of the country. So when you have about 70 acres outside of a major city, top 30 city in America, that has value. And especially if there's no debt on it and, the people control it. What I've found is, this is not exactly your question, Mom, but it's related, that's the strongest position to be in, where you own the land outright and it's contiguous and it's a lot of land. It's not just a portion of a block, it's acres. So a data center or, a whole subdivision or, that's just enough land to do a lot of things, especially in an area that's kind of highly developed. So, to me, those situations, and there are others, you look at Atlanta, where the stadium, got built Mercedes-Benz, and was right in, yeah, exactly, by all the HBCUs, churches, owned all that land. But that's a real opportunity, when you find yourself in a situation like that, to take the land and then use the land as your contribution to the development. And so, what a lot of people do is they'll joint venture with a developer and they'll say, hey, look, all right, our equity is the land. And we're gonna negotiate, find the best participant that wants to do a joint venture with us, and then go from there.
I got one more for you too, then. Look, in South Alabama, my folks were from Monroe, in 19, probably 02 or 18 something, my grandfather and grandmama bought property. Okay, my father moved up here and he bought some property in Fayetteville. And on his deed and on the deed that I bought property in Bessemer, I have no mineral rights.
Oh, yeah.
Now the ones that they bought,
They do.
they have mineral
Yeah.
rights. Do you have to go through that type of?
So in Jefferson County, in Shelby County, because of all the mineral assets, almost, very few people have mineral rights.
USD,
Yeah, so it's very common to see that. When we get involved, we'll have a title company. And, just stepping back for a minute, so everybody's familiar with kind of, residential real estate transaction, where, there's title companies get involved in that. And it's usually a couple $100, when you're doing a commercial transaction, it's a different type of title company. They're, and the premiums won't be different, so instead of a couple $100, you're talking about $10,000 plus dollars, so it's a significant jump when you start to, talk about commercial real estate, especially on a project that's expensive. But one of the things that they'll do is the title company will have a form, and then the form, it has like a list of standard exceptions to title, and one of them is mineral rights. But you can buy an endorsement that basically protects your property right, so you can pay the title company, usually it's less than $1,000, so that when you build your building, even though the mineral rights somebody else, they can't come and knock your building down.
Knock your building down.
So that's what generally happens, on these things, even though it's very,
Right.
very weird, you know, when you see that, but it's usually not an issue.
It's a, go ahead. I was, we allocated more time for you to talk, but we don't start forever, but your father was telling me you got a soccer big game at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, yeah.
We wanna make sure you make the soccer game.
Yeah, thank you.
I was, reading something else. White Americans, I asked who or what ethnicity owns the most property in America. White Americans, by comparison, own more than 98% of US land, amount to 856 million acres, for a total worth of $1 trillion. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Do you know how they acquired it?
They killed about, they stole it from the Indians. Hey, I got one
And a
better.
lot
I
of
got one
them
better
were
than that.
given.
I got one better than, listen to this one. Who is the biggest property owner? Guess who that is? King Charles III of England. The
Oh.
largest landowner in the world currently is King Charles III of England. How much land does the royal family own? He and the British royal family own, they got a 6. And they got another 6. And they got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 zeros.
Wow.
It's a
Acres.
of land around the world. They technically own many territories around the globe, amount to 1/6 of the Earth's surface.
All right,
Wow.
let's take this final question, because I know Randall got to get across
You got to.
town.
And it's a business too.
Alfred,
Don't hear you.
can't hear you. May have to apply the rule to you.
Okay, I would like to make a comment about the land that the British own. Well, when the sun never set on the British Empire, eventually you're gonna end up owning a lot of land. And then not only that, presently they've come up with this scam about the British Commonwealth. Are you familiar with that? The British Commonwealth is what they've done. They went around all the British, all those former colonies. Now they're part of what they call the British Commonwealth. So,
Trump said Canada gonna be the 51st state. He gonna take away from them.
and another thing, as far as the land that the white people own in the United States, when they so-called took all the land from the Indians, west of the Mississippi, well, they had killed all the Indians, and blacks, African Americans, was not able to take advantage of what that Homesteading Act.
Yeah.
That's how they got a lot of that land.
Right. All right,
We wanna thank you, man.
thanks,
Thank you.
Randall, for the presentation,
You got anything else you want to say?
and thanks to the
I'm good.
audience.
I was checking everything. I think I hit everything I wanted to hit.
And we will see y'all next Wednesday, and our guest will be Reverend Marion Roston, who is the pastor of the St. Paul Methodist Church, the church next to 16th Street,
Yeah.
where Joseph Lowry was the pastor once. And they were active in the civil rights movement. So thank you,
Next time.
and we'll see you next.
Thank you,
week.
Randall. Enjoy that.
Right, thank you very much. You were dead on time, we needed that. And your dad is getting better and better with that machine over there.